Kylian Mbappe was exhausted. The long football season had been grueling, with high-intensity matches, relentless training sessions, and the ever-mounting pressure of being one of the world's top footballers. He finally had a few days to himself and had decided to take a short trip. A chance to escape, breathe, and unwind before the next round of club and international duties took over his life again. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The flight he had boarded was meant to be a routine one, nothing extraordinary, just a quiet trip across the Atlantic on a first-class seat where he could close his eyes, listen to music, and relax. But the moment he stepped into the aircraft, he felt something was off. He was used to being recognized. Fans often whispered excitedly or shyly approached him for a photo, but this time there was no warmth. The moment he locked eyes with one of the flight attendants, a middle-aged man with an unmistakable air of arrogance, he felt the first spark of unease. He brushed it off. He had encountered all kinds of people in his career, from ecstatic supporters to bitter rivals who couldn't hide their envy. But as he settled into his seat, it became impossible to ignore the way the flight attendant continued to glance at him, his face twisted with something close to disdain. When it was time for the first meal service, the tension escalated. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Gregory, approached the other passengers in first class with a wide, polite smile. He took orders, exchanged pleasantries, and exuded a professional demeanor. But when he reached Mbappe, his entire attitude shifted. His smile disappeared, and instead, he looked at the French star as if he were an intruder. "You must be in the wrong seat," Gregory said with a slight sneer. Mbappe frowned, confused. "No, this is my seat," he replied calmly, handing over his boarding pass. Gregory barely glanced at it before tossing it back onto the tray table. "Sure," he muttered before turning away without taking his order. Mbappe could feel the eyes of the nearby passengers on him. A few of them recognized him, their gazes filled with curiosity and confusion. Was it possible that the flight attendant didn't know who he was? It didn't matter. Whether he was famous or not, no one deserved to be treated with such blatant disrespect. Still, he let it slide. He had dealt with far worse in his career. If a flight attendant wanted to be rude to him, so be it. He wasn't going to let it ruin his trip. But then, things took a darker turn. When the meals arrived, Gregory deliberately skipped Mbappe. The other passengers received their trays, their drinks, their warm towels. But when Mbappe pressed the service button to inquire about his missing meal, the same flight attendant returned with an annoyed sigh. "What do you want?" Gregory asked, his voice laced with irritation. "My meal," Mbappe said, keeping his voice steady. "You forgot mine." Gregory let out a short laugh. "Oh, I didn't forget," he said. "We must have run out. Maybe check economy class. They might have something left for you." A stunned silence fell over the first-class cabin. A few passengers audibly gasped. The implication was clear. Mbappe was being told he didn't belong in first class. The racial undertone of the statement was impossible to ignore. Mbappe had experienced racism before, both subtle and outright vile. But this was the first time he was being humiliated so openly, so brazenly, by someone who was supposed to be a professional. He could feel his blood boiling, but he refused to let his emotions get the better of him. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Gregory only smirked. "If you have a complaint, you can take it up with customer service after we land." Mbappe clenched his jaw. He knew if he caused a scene, it would be twisted in the media. The headlines would paint him as an entitled celebrity throwing a tantrum on a plane. So he did what he had learned to do best. He remained composed. But the other passengers weren't having it. One by one, people in first class started speaking up. "This is unacceptable," an older woman said, shaking her head. "You're treating him differently and we can all see it." "He's a paying passenger like the rest of us," another man chimed in. "Apologize to him and do your job properly." Gregory's smirk wavered. He had clearly not expected anyone to stand up for Mbappe. The footballer himself sat back, watching the situation unfold with an unreadable expression. At that moment, a second flight attendant, this one a woman with a much kinder demeanor, rushed over. She had clearly overheard the commotion and looked horrified. "Mr. Mbappe, I deeply apologize," she said hurriedly. "This is unacceptable. Let me get your meal right away." She turned to Gregory with a glare. "Can I speak to you in the galley now?" Gregory's face turned red with embarrassment. but he had no choice but to follow her. When the woman returned, she personally served Mbappe his meal, bowing her head slightly as she did so. "I am so sorry," she repeated. "This is not how we treat our passengers." Mbappe nodded, appreciating her sincerity. "Thank you." But the situation was far from over. Unbeknownst to Gregory, several passengers had recorded the incident on their phones. By the time the flight landed, the footage had already been uploaded online, going viral within minutes. Social media exploded. The hashtag #JusticeForMbappe trended worldwide as millions of people expressed their outrage. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines condemning the blatant racism displayed in the video. The airline was forced to respond. Within hours, they issued an official statement, apologizing to Mbappe and promising a full investigation. But it wasn't enough. The public demanded real consequences. By the next morning, the airline announced that Gregory had been suspended indefinitely pending an internal review. But the backlash was so intense that it didn't stop there. Sponsors began pulling support from the airline. Prominent figures in sports and entertainment voiced their anger, and even politicians weighed in, condemning the incident. Mbappe himself, however, chose to handle the situation with grace. In a statement released on his social media, he wrote, "I have faced many challenges in my career, but this one is bigger than me. This is about respect, about equality, and about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. Let's stand together against discrimination in all its forms." His words resonated. The airline not only fired Gregory, but also announced a new diversity and inclusion training program for all employees. Other airlines followed suit, committing to stricter policies against discrimination. What had begun as a humiliating moment on a plane turned into a global conversation about racism in customer service industries. Mbappe hadn't just won a fight for himself. He had sparked change for thousands of others who had suffered in silence. And that was the real victory. As the scandal unfolded, Mbappe found himself at the center of a firestorm of attention. The incident was no longer just about him. It had ignited a broader debate about racial discrimination in the airline industry and beyond. Messages of support flooded in from fans, fellow athletes, and high-profile figures around the world. Some shared their own experiences with racial profiling while traveling, further fueling the discourse. Despite the overwhelming support, there were also those who downplayed the incident. A small but vocal group tried to twist the narrative, accusing Mbappe of playing the victim or exaggerating the situation for attention. Others attempted to justify Gregory's behavior, claiming that maybe it was just a misunderstanding, or suggesting that the flight attendant had simply been having a bad day. But the video evidence was clear. There was no room for misinterpretation. Mbappe, however, refused to engage in back-and-forth arguments with detractors. Instead, he focused on using his platform to push for meaningful change. He teamed up with several advocacy organizations that fought against racial discrimination in travel and hospitality, using his influence to shed light on an issue that had long been ignored. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the airline was scrambling to contain the damage. Their initial response, suspending Gregory and issuing an apology, was not enough to quell the public outrage. Shareholders expressed concerns about the company's image, and the CEO was forced to issue a personal statement addressing the controversy. In it, he condemned Gregory's actions unequivocally and promised sweeping changes within the company. But the damage had already been done. Within days, the airline's stock prices took a hit, and several high-profile celebrities and business figures announced they would be boycotting the company until it demonstrated real reform. As more details about Gregory emerged, the public's anger only grew. Investigative journalists uncovered reports from former employees who claimed he had a history of discriminatory behavior. Some revealed that they had previously complained about his attitude toward passengers of color, but their concerns had been ignored. One former flight attendant who had worked alongside him for years gave a damning interview in which she stated, "Everyone knew Gregory had a problem with certain passengers. This isn't new. What happened to Kylian Mbappe was just the first time he got caught on camera." The revelation led to even more pressure on the airline. If they had known about Gregory's behavior and failed to act, then they weren't just dealing with a rogue employee. They were complicit in allowing racism to fester within their ranks. With mounting pressure from both the public and their investors, The airline took drastic action. Gregory was officially fired, and the company announced a complete overhaul of its training programs, focusing on diversity, inclusion, and anti-discrimination policies. They also pledged to review past complaints to ensure that similar incidents had not been swept under the rug. As for Mbappe, he continued to handle the situation with grace. While he appreciated the support from fans and activists, he made it clear that this was never about him personally. It was about the broader issue of racial discrimination that so many others had faced. He used his platform to highlight stories of everyday people who had endured similar treatment but had never had the chance to fight back in the same way. In one particularly powerful social media post, he shared messages from individuals who had experienced racism while traveling. One was from a young black woman who had been asked to prove she was in first class before being allowed to take her seat. Another was from a Latino businessman who had been repeatedly mistaken for an airline worker rather than a paying passenger. Their stories were painful, but they underscored the fact that what had happened to Mbappe was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger pattern of discrimination. Beyond the airline industry, the incident sparked wider discussions about racism in sports and society as a whole. Prominent football clubs, including his own, expressed solidarity with him, and several of his teammates voiced their own experiences of discrimination both on and off the field. Some took the opportunity to call out the racist abuse that players of color often faced from fans and the media, demanding that football governing bodies take stronger action against such behavior. Even FIFA and UEFA issued statements condemning racism and reaffirming their commitment to tackling discrimination in football. While such statements were nothing new, the timing of this particular controversy put added pressure on these organizations to take concrete steps rather than just offering words. Meanwhile, Mbappe's legal team quietly explored their options. While he had no interest in dragging the situation into a drawn-out legal battle, his lawyers made it clear that he had every right to sue the airline for racial discrimination. However, rather than pursuing financial compensation, Mbappe made a surprising move. He demanded that any legal settlement be used to fund anti-racism initiatives in travel and tourism. The airline, eager to put the scandal behind them, agreed to his terms. They pledged a substantial donation to several anti-discrimination organizations and announced a new internal policy to prevent similar incidents from happening again. Despite these victories, Mbappe knew the fight against racism wasn't over. One high-profile incident, no matter how much attention it garnered, wouldn't erase the centuries-old prejudices that still lingered in society. But what it did do was shine a light on an issue that too many people had been forced to endure in silence. As the weeks passed, the controversy gradually began to fade from the headlines, but its impact remained. The airline continued to face scrutiny, with journalists keeping a close eye on whether they followed through on their promises. Other major airlines took note, some even preemptively introducing stricter anti-discrimination policies to avoid finding themselves in a similar scandal. For Mbappe, life moved on, but he was forever changed by the experience. He had always known that racism existed in many forms, but this particular incident had shown him how deep it ran, even in the spaces reserved for the wealthy and elite. It was a stark reminder that no amount of fame or success could shield a person from prejudice. Yet he also took comfort in the fact that people had stood up for him. The passengers who had spoken out, the social media users who had amplified his story, and the activists who had taken this moment and turned it into a movement. These were the real heroes. They had proven that silence was no longer an option, that discrimination could and would be challenged wherever it appeared. As he stepped onto the pitch for his next game, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always played for the love of the sport, for the thrill of competition, for the dream of lifting trophies. But now, he played for something bigger. He played for every young boy and girl who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. He played to show them that no matter how many obstacles were placed in their way, they could rise above them. And as he scored a stunning goal that night, the crowd erupting in celebration, he knew that this, his talent, his resilience, his determination, was the greatest response he could give to those who had tried to diminish him. He was Kylian Mbappe, and nothing, not even racism at 35,000 feet, could bring him down. The impact of the incident continued to ripple across the world long after the initial storm of outrage had passed. Though the airline had taken measures to repair its damaged reputation, the deeper issues surrounding discrimination in the travel industry could not be so easily brushed aside. In the days following the controversy, Mbappe was inundated with messages from people who had endured similar injustices but never had the platform to fight back. Some were ordinary travelers who had been humiliated by airline staff, while others were well-known figures who shared their own experiences of racial profiling. His direct messages on social media were flooded with accounts of people who had been denied service, falsely accused of wrongdoing, or outright removed from flights simply because of the color of their skin. It was clear that this wasn't just an isolated case of one racist flight attendant. It was a systemic problem. Airlines worldwide were now under pressure to review their policies, and many scrambled to introduce new training programs and revise their guidelines to avoid being the next company in the hot seat. But Mbappe was not content with just being the face of the issue. He wanted to take action in a way that could bring about lasting change. Within weeks, he announced the launch of a new initiative aimed at combating racial discrimination in the travel and hospitality industries. Partnering with several international advocacy groups, he created a watchdog organization that would collect and document cases of discrimination, providing legal resources to those who had been wrongfully mistreated. This initiative, which he named Equal Skies, would work alongside legal experts to challenge discriminatory practices in major airline companies, pressuring them to implement policies that ensured fair treatment for all passengers, regardless of race, nationality, or background. Airlines that refused to comply with these new standards would be publicly named and boycotted, a tactic that had already proven to be highly effective in an era where public perception could make or break a brand. The response to Equal Skies was overwhelming. Within a month, thousands of travelers submitted reports of their experiences, and the organization quickly grew into a global movement. Several airlines, eager to avoid further bad press, reached out to Mbappe's team directly, expressing a willingness to work together to improve their policies. Meanwhile, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, Gregory, had gone into hiding after being fired from his job. While some outlets attempted to paint him as a victim of cancel culture, most people saw through the narrative. His past actions had finally caught up with him, and no amount of excuses could erase the video evidence that had exposed him. However, the story took an unexpected turn when a group of investigative journalists dug deeper into his history. What they uncovered was far worse than anyone had initially realized. Gregory had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, not just for racial discrimination, but for a pattern of aggressive and inappropriate behavior toward passengers and coworkers. Shockingly, it was revealed that he had been quietly reassigned several times within the airline rather than being held accountable for his actions. Instead of terminating him after multiple warnings, the company had chosen to protect him, likely assuming that none of his previous victims had the means or influence to expose the pattern of abuse. This revelation ignited yet another wave of outrage, prompting calls for an even deeper investigation into the airline's handling of discrimination complaints. Former employees of the company came forward with their own stories, detailing how they had been pressured into staying silent when they witnessed misconduct. Some had even been punished for attempting to report racist behavior among staff. Mbappe, seeing the growing movement his case had inspired, remained steadfast in his commitment to justice. He took part in panel discussions, speaking at global conferences about the need for reform in customer service industries. His voice carried weight, not just as an athlete, but as a powerful advocate for human rights. As the scandal continued to unfold, it had far-reaching consequences beyond just the airline industry. Other sectors, including luxury hotels, restaurants, and even car rental services, found themselves under increased scrutiny. People who had long endured racial profiling in these spaces finally had a platform to share their experiences, and businesses were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that discrimination was deeply embedded in their operations. As a direct result of the movement sparked by Mbappe's ordeal, several new laws were proposed in multiple countries aimed at strengthening protections against racial discrimination in public services. Lawmakers introduced measures requiring companies to implement mandatory anti-racism training, establish clearer channels for reporting misconduct, and enforce stricter penalties for employees found guilty of discriminatory behavior. For Mbappe himself, life continued at its usual breakneck pace. The demands of professional football were as relentless as ever, with new matches, tournaments, and training sessions consuming most of his time. But something had changed within him. He was no longer just a footballer. He was a symbol of resilience, a leader beyond the pitch. He found himself receiving invitations to speak at universities, where young students studying law and human rights wanted to hear his perspective on using fame as a force for change. Some even asked him if he had ever considered a future in politics. For now, his heart remained in football. He still had titles to win, records to break, and a legacy to build on the field. But he had also realized that his influence extended far beyond the sport he loved. As he traveled the world for matches, he saw firsthand the changes that had begun to take shape because of his stand against discrimination. Airline employees now went through more rigorous training, with some companies even hiring independent monitors to ensure that passengers were treated fairly. He would often hear from fans who told him that his actions had inspired them to stand up for themselves in similar situations. People who had once stayed silent when faced with discrimination now felt emboldened to speak out, knowing that their voices mattered. His teammates, too, admired his courage. Many of them had experienced their own moments of racial prejudice, but had never had the platform or the confidence to challenge it as publicly as he had. One night, after an intense Champions League match, a young player from the opposing team approached him in the tunnel. He looked nervous at first, but eventually he gathered the courage to speak. "Hey, Kylian," the young man said. "I just wanted to say, what you did after that whole flight situation, that meant a lot. I've been through stuff like that too, but I never thought I could do anything about it. Seeing you fight back the way you did, it gave me hope, man. Just wanted you to know that." Mbappe smiled, reaching out to shake the player's hand. "That means everything to me," he said. "Just remember, you always have a voice. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." As he walked away, Mbappe reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short span of time. He had always been a fighter. On the pitch, he battled defenders, pushing himself to be the best. But this was a different kind of fight, one that mattered on a much deeper level, and he knew it wasn't over. There were still battles to be won, injustices to be challenged, and voices that needed to be heard. He was ready for all of it. Despite the passage of time, the impact of what had happened to Mbappe remained fresh in the minds of millions. What had initially been a case of personal humiliation had transformed into a catalyst for real change. The controversy no longer belonged to him alone. It had become part of a larger fight, a movement that had taken on a life of its own. The airline industry, now under global scrutiny, continued to grapple with the fallout. Several airlines conducted internal audits to determine whether systemic discrimination existed within their organizations. Some even enlisted third-party watchdog groups to assess their practices and ensure fair treatment of all passengers. It became evident that Kylian Mbappe's ordeal had not been an anomaly. It had been a symptom of a widespread problem that had festered for years, hidden behind polite smiles and corporate jargon. Governments, too, took notice. In France, a parliamentary hearing was scheduled to address the broader issue of racial discrimination in customer service industries with a particular focus on travel. Mbappe was invited to testify, but he chose instead to send a heartfelt letter, urging lawmakers to take real action rather than simply acknowledging the problem. His words resonated deeply. "I am not the first person to experience this, and I will not be the last. I was fortunate enough to have a platform that allowed my voice to be heard, but many others suffer in silence. The responsibility falls on us, not just as individuals, but as societies, to ensure that no one is made to feel like a lesser human being because of the color of their skin. Discrimination in any form is unacceptable, and it is time we stop treating it as an unfortunate reality and start treating it as a problem to be eradicated." His letter was widely circulated, praised for its eloquence and emotional depth. Activists hailed his decision to shift the focus away from himself and onto the greater issue at hand. His actions had never been about personal retribution, but about bringing a deeply rooted issue to the forefront. While all of this unfolded, Mbappe remained focused on his career. He continued to play at the highest level, breaking records and dazzling fans with his performances. But there was a newfound weight to his presence on and off the pitch. He was no longer just a footballer, he had become an agent of change. At one of his club's press conferences, a journalist asked him whether he felt the incident had changed him as a person. He took a deep breath before responding. "I think it made me see things more clearly. It showed me that no matter who you are, no matter how successful you become, there are still people who will judge you based on something as meaningless as the color of your skin. But it also showed me the power of speaking up. If I had let it go, if I had stayed silent, nothing would have changed. So yes, I think I have changed. I've learned that my voice can be used for more than just football, and I intend to use it." His words were replayed across television screens and social media feeds, a reminder that he was more than just an athlete. He had stepped into a role that few footballers had willingly embraced, the role of an advocate, an inspiration beyond the realm of sports. Meanwhile, Equal Skies, the initiative he had founded, continued to gain traction. More and more travelers reported their experiences, some leading to legal action against airlines that had long turned a blind eye to racial discrimination. Several high-profile lawsuits emerged, forcing companies to settle for millions and admit wrongdoing. The organization also began working with airport security agencies to address racial profiling, another pervasive issue that had affected countless travelers around the world. One particularly notable case involved a black businessman who had been detained at an airport on suspicion of using a stolen credit card, simply because he had been purchasing a first-class ticket. Equal Skies provided him with legal counsel, and the case quickly gained international attention. In court, the airline was forced to release its internal guidelines, revealing shocking disparities in how passengers of different ethnic backgrounds were treated. The victory was a landmark moment, sending a strong message that racial profiling would no longer be tolerated. Mbappe, though heavily involved with Equal Skies, remained selective about his public statements. He didn't want the focus to be on him alone. He wanted the movement to belong to everyone. But there were moments when he couldn't avoid the attention. During a match in England, a group of fans held up a banner that read, "Respect for Mbappe, respect for all." The stadium erupted in applause, and for the first time since the incident, he allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't about personal validation. It was about knowing that something real had come from his experience. Despite the overwhelming positivity that had come from his actions, he was not naive. He knew that racism would not disappear overnight. There would always be those who resisted change, who dismissed conversations about discrimination as overblown or divisive. He had seen it in the backlash against Equal Skies, with some critics claiming that his efforts were unnecessary or even bad for business. But he also knew that progress had never been achieved by those who remained silent. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, he received an unexpected phone call. It was an elderly man, a retired footballer who had played decades before him. "Kylian, I just wanted to tell you something," the man said, his voice filled with emotion. "When I was your age, I went through things that I could never speak about. They told us to keep our heads down, to just be grateful that we were allowed to play. But you're doing what we never had the chance to do. You're speaking out. And because of that, the next generation will have it a little bit easier. So thank you. You're making history, even if you don't realize it." Mbappe was silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "I'm just trying to do what's right," he said. "But thank you. That means more than you know." As he hung up, he sat back and reflected on everything that had happened. The humiliating incident on the flight, the global outrage, the movement that had followed. It had been a whirlwind, but through it all, he had learned something invaluable. Change wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It wasn't about revenge, nor was it about personal victories. It was about persistence. It was about refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. It was about making sure that little by little, the world became a better place for those who came after him. And with that thought, he made a quiet vow to himself. No matter how many goals he scored, no matter how many trophies he lifted, this, fighting for fairness, standing up for those who couldn't, would always be part of his legacy. And he wouldn't let anyone take that away from him. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Kylian Mbappe's incident with the racist flight attendant? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.